Hey everybody. Today we're going to get into the 1920s, sometimes referred to as the Roaring Twenties. We're talking about a period of economic boom, economic expansion for some, but for a lot of people, a lot of Americans, things aren't going so well. Today we're going to look a little bit about some of the bad things that are happening in the 1920s. We're going to talk about this idea of radicalism, the potential communist threat, the Red Scare. We'll look a little bit about the Harding and Coolidge presidency, and we'll talk a little about some foreign policy. Eventually, we'll get into the cultural aspects of the 1920s. In the pictures here, you can see a little bit of the assembly line, the building of cars. We'll talk about the New Age, fancy dance moves like the Charleston. We'll talk about the development of radio, Lindbergh. We'll talk about sports figures like Babe Ruth. We'll talk about jazz. You guys like jazz? We'll talk about gangsters like Al Capone, and we'll talk about some things we've already discussed like Prohibition, and we'll talk about the Quota Acts of 1921 and 1924 again. So let's get going with radicalism. Maybe. There we go. Okay, so time of turmoil in the sense that the communist threat, or the potential communist threat, really starts to get to the core of our government figures and the public. This threat of communism is in the back of our government's mind and the people's minds ever since this new wave of immigration in the late 1800s, early 1900s. People are kind of freaked out about the potential threat of a communist revolution happening in the United States. When it happened in 1917 over in Russia, people got freaked out, and as more and more of these immigrants from Eastern Europe were starting to come over, the potential threat of communists infiltrating our government and our schools and our workplaces and our just everyday way of life became a sort of real threat to many Americans. In reality, could it really have happened? Probably not. I mean, there were communist parties and communist members and people who supported communism, but the likelihood of an actual communist revolution in the U.S. was probably pretty far off. But the perceived threat was enough to cause the government to create a lot of actions and policies to sort of deny people their civil liberties and to try and put down this potential threat. So if you hear me talking about the Reds, we're talking about the communists. Red is associated with communism, the whole communist flag thing. In this political cartoon, you can see on the top of his hat here, it says Reds, and you have this guy who looks like a stereotypical Russian with a big beard, and on it says Bolshevism. That's this idea of like the communists. And then in the torch, it says anarchy. Anarchy is this idea of like getting rid of all government systems. So creeping in underneath the American flag or symbol, right? It represents this idea of the potential creeping communist threat looming on the horizon. So this political cartoon kind of sums up the attitudes of American government officials and some of the public. When it comes to rooting out the potential communist threat, two people should come to mind. One is Attorney General Mitchell Palmer and Deputy J. Edgar Hoover. All right, the Attorney General, he's like the head lawyer of the government, and Hoover was the deputy. This is a picture of young J. Edgar Hoover, and here's Mitchell Palmer. These two guys were trying to root out the communist threat within our government and within our society. They became famous for what's been known or called the Palmer Raids, where over 10,000 citizens who were suspected of communism or deviant behavior or associated with anarchism were charged and arrested. A lot of them, they questioned them and detained them or whatever, and they found out, okay, there's not enough evidence, and they let them go. But a lot of people they kept in jail, kept in prison for their ties to communist parties. There were a lot of events. There were some violent acts committed by anarchists and communists. In this picture down here, 1920 bombing in Wall Street in New York City. This gave Palmer and Hoover enough sort of evidence to say, all right, now we've got an event here that will allow us to root out the potential communist threat. So events and bombings, these were kind of common. Like a lot of these riots and random acts of violence all got kind of tied in and connected. Sometimes rightfully so, but sometimes, a lot of times, over-exaggerated the actual connection and threat to communism. But it gave the government enough credibility, and it gave them enough reason to sort of go after suspected communists or known communists. A real famous incident involving immigrants, people from Eastern Europe, people who held a different belief about government systems, was the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti. These are two Italian immigrants. They were known anarchists. They were accused of killing two men during an armed robbery. There's a ton of evidence that supports that they weren't involved in this. They had a pretty solid alibi. However, the jury held some prejudice towards these two guys because of their background, because of the fact that they were the new immigrants, and because of their political leanings and views. So the jury kind of, ignored all the evidence and basically convicted them as guilty. So in 1921, they were sentenced, and then in 1927, they were actually put to death. If you're ever up in the Syracuse University area, going to a football game or a basketball game, if you go to the H.B. Krause Hall building, you will see this mural on the side of the building. It is to commemorate the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti. It's called The Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti, and it's by the artist Ben Shahn, and it just kind of points out the unfair trial. You can see Sacco and Vanzetti and their shadows looming large. So if you're ever up in Syracuse, check it out. It's in the quad. Okay, so what? Who cares about two Italian immigrants put to death? It really reflects the American attitudes and views towards not just immigrants at the time, but people of different cultures, ethnicities, people with different political views. It really sums up the whole attitude of the people and the government towards the whole Red Scare. If you were different, if you thought differently, had different political outlook or view, you were a threat. So if you were an immigrant or someone who supported communism or anarchism, you were a target in America at this time. So the 1920s were a time of turmoil for you and for many Americans in that same boat. The 1920s, labor issues. So we talked before during the Second Industrial Revolution about the increase of unions and people using strikes to increase their pay and get better hours, better working conditions. These labor issues are still continuing throughout the 1920s and 30s and so on. However, that Red Scare element is now being thrown into the mix with the labor issues. So as people start to strike and as they start to shut down industries, all in order to get their own rights at work and to get better pay, make a better life for themselves, now that communist element is starting to creep into the labor issue strikes. People are associating unions and strikes with communists. Oh, the communists are trying to disrupt the industry and shut down the way of American life. The communists are the one responsible for starting these strikes and promoting the idea of striking. So striking for your rights and a better life and a better working condition became synonymous with communism. And it really started to shift the American public when you had, for instance, in Gary, Indiana in 1919, when you have these massive riots break out, and you have the police and you have the military come in and people start dying, people are getting shot, bombs are going off. People start associating this violence with communism, and therefore they associate strikes with communism. Therefore, strikes, labor issues are bad. Basically, shut up, go to work, do your job. Who cares how much you're getting paid? You should be lucky that you have a job. So it's a big shift from, in terms of how people view labor in America. Kind of a scary time for many workers. And of course, if we're talking U.S. history, racial tensions, racial issues is coming up again. America is and always will be that, have that part of history connected to its issues with race. Since slavery, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments of Reconstruction, we still haven't really fulfilled those amendments in the 1920s. We have, throughout the 1920s, 1930s, and even up through the 1970s, what's called the Great Migration, where you have roughly 6 million African Americans who are leaving the South to seek better economic opportunities and social opportunities in the North. All right, trying to escape things like Jim Crow laws, segregation in the South, lots of violence and racism and prejudice, to the point where people are being killed. Right? We talked about lynchings, hanging people. That stuff is bad. They're leaving the South and trying to escape that to get to the North. However, the North is not, perfect either. There's still racism, there's still prejudice, but in most cases not to the same degree as what it was in the South. However, it's not always the best either. Point in case, in 1917, you have these riots break out in St. Louis. There's this people assume that these black people killed these white people and over a robbery, and then the white mob goes after the black people, and they start shooting people in the streets of St. Louis. And the next thing you know, more people are shooting at each other, and then like a couple city blocks get burned up in flames, and it's pretty awful. And then in Chicago, 1919, more riots break out after these white kids were throwing stones at these black kids who were swimming in Lake Michigan. Stone hits one of the black kids in the head, and he drowns, and then that creates a whole race riot. So, I mean, these are like northern cities, and this is just, kind of common. Like throughout a lot of American cities, you have a lot of these riots, all kind of race related. So racial tensions are running pretty high throughout America at this point. There's still a lot of serious amounts of violence towards black people in this country in the 1920s. So we're still a long way away from like the true spirit of what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were really trying to do. The civil rights movement is kind of in its infancy. We're starting to look to push towards making those Reconstruction Amendments a real thing and to provide real legal protection for black people in this country. We'll talk more about it when we get into the 1940s, 50s, and 60s too. Okay. Here's a map just kind of outlining the Great Migration. You can see here, here's the South, these blue states. Typically, most people in these areas, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, would kind of move north through Missouri, Illinois, Iowa, parts of Minneapolis, Minnesota. You had some people that move out west. You have people from the Middle South kind of move directly north into the Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan region. And people from the eastern part would just kind of continue their way up the coast into like Pittsburgh and New York and all the major cities, Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore. This is the Great Migration. Harding and Coolidge presidencies. All right, Warren G. Harding from 1920 1923. His policy, his big plan was to return to normalcy. Let's kind of, World War I is over. Let's return back to our normal focus on America issues. His presidency, not so good. A lot of corruption. He surrounded himself with some of his buddies from his home state of Ohio, known as the Ohio Gang, and they were corrupt and dishonest, and they were not really qualified for the positions they had. Think of the spoil system that we talked about earlier. The big infamous scandal was the Teapot Dome scandal. One of his buddies in the Ohio Gang, Albert Fall, he leased out some government land to oil companies in exchange for $400,000. That's not legit. That's not legal. You can't be giving favors out to oil companies in exchange for money. That's an abuse of the government. And Harding actually dies in office. So his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, takes over in 1923 to 1927. Coolidge was like 180 from Harding. He was known as Silent Cal. He was more honest. He got rid of the Ohio Gang, corrupt people. But both Harding and Coolidge were really pro-business. All right, they wanted this less government, less is more approach. Let's get the government out of, regulating businesses. It's a laissez-faire approach. The French word for means hands off. And the idea was let the business do their own thing, and the government will just kind of take a back seat and play less of a role. Did some bad things too, did away with some child labor laws, and he also did away with some laws that were progressive and towards getting women better pay. That's good for businesses because they don't have to pay women as much and they don't have to pay children as much, so it helps the businesses make more money, but it's bad for children, it's bad for women. So the main idea with these two presidencies, really pro-business, good for expanding the American economy in the 1920s. But in terms of like, were they really the best guys? Maybe sort of, I don't know, it's subjective, but the corruption and the dishonesty from Harding and the, labor issues with Coolidge, one could argue, maybe not so good socially. Economically, yes, but yeah. Okay, foreign policy, like I said, the main idea here after World War I, returning to isolationist policy. Let's stay out of European affairs. We want nothing to do with another world war. The Senate rejects the League of Nations. We want no part of that. However, the idea of militarization, that's still kind of a thing with Britain and Japan and the United States. We're cranking up production of our naval fleets, and then we kind of realize maybe we should chill on that. And we create in 1922 what's called the Five-Power Treaty, where Japan, U.S., and Britain, as well as France and Italy, agree to limit the size of their navies. However, it was kind of tilted in the favor of Britain and the United States. For every 5 tons that the U.S. and Britain made in terms of naval ships, all right, so let's say your ships were 20 tons, all right, so for every 5 tons of that 20-ton ship, Japan could make up to 3 tons for their ships. And France got a 1.67-ton ratio, and Italy got a 1.67-ton ratio. So U.S. and Britain can make way more tonnage towards their naval ships. Japan was kind of in the middle. France and Italy, they're not making as much ships as the U.S. But it's kind of sort of an effort to limit the size of the navies of these major industrial countries. Loophole, though. There's no restriction on small warships, the cruisers. So you can kind of crank those out left and right. It's the really big ones that you couldn't make. So kind of sort of a step in the right direction in demilitarizing the major countries. Another step in the right direction, in 1928, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. 14 major industrial nations say, we're going to outlaw war. War is now illegal. We are ending war. It's never going to happen again. And I'm the Tooth Fairy. Awesome. Okay, the problem with the Kellogg-Briand Pact is that there's no way to enforce this issue. If countries really wanted to go to war, they could do it. No one's going to stop them. There's no like police force, international police force that's going to like regulate this. It's kind of just a goodwill sort of thing. Good in theory, good in practice, but you know, there's the whole World War II thing that we'll get into later. The U.S. is doing some big things, though. We're kind of taking a step back from our whole, you know, policing, international policing, speaking of which, in Latin America in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when we were rapidly and aggressively imperializing Latin America, South America. In the 1920s, under Coolidge, we actually take a step back from that. We actually pull out a lot of our military troops, and we don't send in troops in Mexico in the 1920s. So it's actually like a hearkening back to Woodrow Wilson's moral diplomacy. We're actually doing that. We're actually, you know, following through with the idea of not really imperializing and trying to spread democracy or whatever. So, yeah, good job. Wilson's pumped about that. Okay, so those are just a few of the topics pertaining to the 1920s. Like I said, we'll get more into the cultural aspect of this decade, and eventually we'll start talking about the 1930s as well. Don't forget to smash that like button.